Hi, welcome to your lecture on video game addiction. Now, there's a lot of media panic around games. Many of you will have encountered arguments like these before, that games are like some sort of a drug, and that playing games is a distraction, it leaves you disoriented and weak, a lot of suggestions that there's a gaming epidemic, suggestions that gaming triggers self-harm in the young, or that games represent serious threats to the mental health of players. Except these are not about games. These are examples of different media panics around reading and writing from history. Socrates wrote in 360 BCE that the written word is like a drug. Seneca wrote in 65 CE that the reading of many books is a distraction that leaves the reader disoriented and weak. There were suggestions in 18th century England that there was a reading epidemic, that reading triggered self-harm in the young, and that it might represent a serious threat to the mental health of the reader. Ancient Greek philosopher Plato even excluded the dramatic poets from his ideal republic on the grounds that they had a harmful influence on the young. The point here is that there are many media panics about many different media, including and people attribute the kind of appeal of different and emerging new forms of media in psychological and medical pathological ways. In 1941, Mary Preston published an article, Children's Reactions to Movie Horrors in Radio Crime, in the Journal of Pediatrics. The American pediatrician had studied hundreds of 6 to 16-year-old children and concluded that over half were severely addicted to radio and movie crime dramas, having given themselves over to a habit-forming practice very difficult to overcome, no matter how the after effects are dreaded. Most strikingly, Preston observed that many consumed these dramas as much as a chronic alcohol does drink. Preston therefore voiced severe concerns about the children's health and future outcomes. Those who consumed more radio crime or movie dramas were more nervous and fearful, suffered from worse general health, and more disturbed eating and sleep. My point here is that media panics are these cyclical events that always arise when new media are introduced into society. Media panics about games are therefore reflective of broader societal concerns and issues of the status, place, and value of games in society. So let's have a look at the video game moral panic in more detail. This comic from the image from the 1980s, Jackson's Son, depicts space invaders and its addictive habits, suggested in this creepy image. Pac-Man is in this image posed as the Pied Piper. The fable tales leads rats to their doom, leading a group of children towards a cliff. Original caption reads, "And the children were never heard from again," from the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1982. According to critics in 1982, over 1/3 of the population could have a heart attack or a stroke playing an arcade game. In this article of a man struggling to survive while playing an arcade game. Although amusing, this comment that captioned, "Mum, Dad, this is Pac-Man, we're gonna be married." One of the reasons that video games were attacked so viciously in 1982 by conservatives was because of the idea that innocent girls were thought to have been unjustly lured into playing video games via Pac-Man, again from the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1982. One interesting tension and an aspect of the media panic around video games now forgotten is the idea that many men felt that home systems were tearing the family apart, from Video Games versus Dad in the Pittsburgh Press in 1982. The idea that, mum and kids playing the video game at home together were then tearing them away from their father. In this deeply dystopic image, we also see the man's iris is replaced with Pac-Man, reflecting the reprogrammed Pac addict in the News Press Sun in 1982. And you can see many more of these types of 1980s media panic around games. But this, of course, is not something limited to the 1980s. Video games are a constant source of blame for kind of violence in society, and in particular gun violence in the United States. The text of the lawsuit brought by families of the Columbine shooting against video game manufacturers reads, "Absent the combination of extremely violent video games and these boys' deep involvement in those games, And their addiction to these games and these murders and the massacre would not have occurred, they claim. Others have weighed in. Donald Trump in 2012 arguing that video game violence and its glorification must be stopped. It is creating violence. And more recently, a lot of the video game media panic has moved away from this association between video games and violence and video games causing violence into more young users and screen time. Articles like these where husband's so addicted to Fortnite that he played for 18 hours a day, children being treated on the NHS in the UK, a battle royale for your mind, and even Prince Harry saying that Fortnite, the video game Fortnite, is irresponsible and should be banned.
Somebody please pick up the children.
I wish I had a palace in which I could hang out in instead of playing video games, but alas, I thus have to play Fortnite. So we're seeing here in this shift towards young users and screen time. And one of the things I've done in my research is study this discourse and how it reflects broader tensions around the different constructions of the purpose of childhood and the need for digital literacies. Children are often what we call a prime object for media panic because they are often media pioneers. They adopt new media quicker than adults do. And children's use of this media challenges social and cultural power relations. Adults who don't understand what the children are doing, kind of creating distance, which creates friction. There's also a lot of ideological rifts about what a childhood should look like. You know, the traditional ideas of playing in the street and playing in a playground versus playing online, just irrespective of the different benefits or drawbacks of either of those. Childhood is often a site of tension with adults because it reflects experience and emotions that are totally lost to us. So this is not to discount any of these media panics as irrelevant. Understanding the discourses about video games can be deeply insightful. As Buckingham and Jensen note in their article about media panics, there is typically a there for a media panic, right? Some sort of nugget of credibility, a rise in violence, or the fact that children are driven to play people just want to play video games, right? It's not that these are addictive things, it's that we want to play video games, and that can cause friction. But it's also really important to recognize that there are differences between media, right? Literature can give us a character's point of view, but films and TV do not. This can cause issues. What is acceptable in one media might not be acceptable in another. A really good example of this was in Game of Thrones, where there is I don't want to spoil it, but there was a controversy around two characters having sex. In the books, you read this from the woman's point of view, and it's clearly consensual because you understand her point of view. But in the TV show, you don't get her point of view, and it comes off as really rapey. And so people who hadn't read the books had a very different kind of interpretation of this scene in the TV show. And it's because there are differences in media, and what is acceptable in one might not be acceptable in another. And I think this is a really important thing to acknowledge when we begin to analyze in one of the subsequent parts of this lecture what content is and isn't appropriate in video games. But this lecture is about whether video games are addictive. In 2018, gaming disorder was added to the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, defined as a pattern of gaming behavior characterized by impaired control over gaming, increased priority given to gaming over other activities to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other interests and daily activities, and continuation or escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. Debates over and research on video game addiction have been around for as long as video games have been. There is no clear resolution for this research to support the World Health Organization's classification of gaming disorder. The overwhelming majority of players do not appear to experience substantial difficulties with balancing their play and outside social roles and responsibilities. At extreme levels, some people who play games are encumbered with problems, but the link between these problems and the video games specifically is not proven. Critics suggest that professional organizations, such as the WHO and the DSM, have inappropriately responded to a societal narrative, negatively impacting scientific and medical processes. If we describe video games as something that are addictive, certain types of research get funded and other types of research don't. World Health Organizations have previously acknowledged that they are under enormous pressure, especially from Asian countries, to include gaming disorder in the DSM. Critics ask why The Who is so obsessed with video games specifically, rather than a catch-all behavioural addiction category that could include any behaviour that is done. If we return to the definition from the World Health Organization, I personally can think of one or two occasions where my reading of books has involved impaired control over reading, increased priority given to reading over other activities to the extent that my reading takes precedence over other interests or daily activities, and the occurrence of negative consequences, because I was a university student when the last Harry Potter book came out and I missed an assignment deadline because I really wanted to read it right away before it got spoiled. Was I addicted to Harry Potter? Probably, or at least according to the World Health Organization. So my point here is that are video games specifically addictive, or can we have a behavioral addiction to different media? And is my interest in books or video games best classified as addiction and pathologized in this way? Right? There's concern that the broad and unsubstantiated classification of gaming disorder trivializes mental illness, putting efforts to destigmatize mental illness in jeopardy. So there's 5 issues with the World Health Organization classification that I'll break down. Firstly, does problems with gaming necessitate a new disorder framed as addiction? Is game addiction a unique diagnostic entry or symptomatic of an underlying mental condition? E.g., hypersomnia is a symptom of excessive sleeping, is a symptom of a depressive episode, but we would not diagnose someone with bed addiction. But someone who has depression might play video games in an excessive way. Why no book addiction, right? When is a hobby merely regularly and enthusiastically engaged in, and when is it a pathological desire? One of the problems with the World Health Organization is that line between enthusiastically engaged and addiction and problematic is so unclear, fuzzy, and movable depending on the circumstances. If it's a unique disorder, there should be documentation of its existence as a solitary condition or as an originating condition. To date, research has shown no convincing casework of video game addiction as a solitary condition, as in the video game addiction emerged despite the person otherwise being perfectly happy and content in their lives. A further issue is that the instruments for measuring gaming disorder or gaming addiction are really, really terrible. They rely on self-report surveys, and we know that people are really, really bad at estimating how much time they spend doing leisure. They're produced with very heterogeneous assumptions, reformulate gambling abuse disorders, assuming that these transfer to video game disorders. Some instruments even just replace the word heroin with video games, right? Losing interests in old hobbies to pursue gaming, probably okay. Losing interest in old hobbies to pursue heroin, might be a bit worried, right? Using games to relieve stress, not great with heroin, okay with video games. So, and does saying, yes, I use video games to relieve stress, is that really indicative that you're addicted to video games? A third issue is that video game addiction is not a stable construct. There's a lot of research that suggests that people who play video games excessively, that is a fairly transient thing. It doesn't require intervention by a medical practitioner. It's typically dependent on or related to other life conditions, lack of employment, relationship breakdown, and so on. But it doesn't persist over those life conditions change. You get a new job or a new relationship. Another issue with the World Health Organization's classification is that the benefits of video game play are at risk. The World Health Organization's classification perpetuates a moral panic that makes the positive use of video games less likely. We know in this unit that video games have a really positive potential in the context of serious games. We know that video games serve our emotional needs. They provide intellectual stimulation, physical rehabilitation, educational, social, personality development, increased stress tolerance, and the promotion of pro-social behaviors and problem-solving skills. The World Health Organization's classification puts these benefits at risks. And I ask, would we even be having this conversation if games weren't typically about guns and violence? There are also unintended consequences of the World Health Organization's classifications. The term addiction used by the APA connotes severe consequences which are not supported scientifically. It undermines the study and treatment of real addiction and has led to predatory treatment clinics in the United States and Asia. In my studies of children's play of Fortnite, children would joke to each other about being addicted Oh, you're addicted. Get off the computer. Stop being addicted to Fortnite. You got to come play Minecraft with me. Could this make them be less likely to see gambling addiction or alcohol addiction as a serious problem? Could this mean that they are less likely to take seriously the warnings of adults or teachers who refer to the video game as being addictive when they themselves know that's kind of a bit silly? So to kind of summarize this lecture on video game addiction, the research literature does not support the classification of games as video game addiction as a distinct disorder. Current classifications and efforts to classify gaming as problematic are perhaps more reflective of the moral panic around video games than they are of research. And in any case, many researchers argue that addiction is not the right framework to understand problematic video game behavior. The rush to pathologize video games may have many other negative consequences, such as detracting from the possible benefits of digital play in domains beyond leisure, and the benefits of being able to play games when we want to. That question, would we be having this conversation if video games weren't all about violence and killing? Does this kind of negative media panic and association with video games limit the creative potential of video games to expand into more different players and in more interesting domains? So thanks very much for joining us on this lecture on video game addiction. I look forward to seeing you in the next part. Catch you later.